For this session, we'll be talking about the future of work and income distribution. And the first thing that comes to mind when we think future of work is automation and digital transformation. So many questions come to mind. Are robots taking over? Are people going to lose their jobs? Is artificial intelligence good or bad? And what about the skills needed, and how can we empower the generations of youth with those skills needed in the market? These are all very valid questions for developed and developing countries alike. But today we're going to learn, are these topics differently addressed in developed countries versus developing countries? And this is what our speakers are going to tell us today about these topics. Let me first introduce our two speakers. Silvia works at the Department of Economics at University College London. She has been teaching in higher education for the past 20 years. Her scholarly research interests are in the areas of development and international economics, as well as the economics of cryptocurrencies. Vladimir is an associate professor of economics at Ewha, is it pronounced right? Ewha Women's University in Seoul. He specializes in labor and welfare economics, particularly in relation to Asia and the Middle East region. We're going to listen to the two presentations, and then we're going to have, again, Professor Raghi Asad. He's going to give a comment on the two presentations. He's going to give us from his knowledge on the two topics, and then we're going to move on to a discussion. So let's first start with our first presenter, Silvia.
Thanks a lot for the introduction. What I'm going to do today, I'm going to provide you with an overview of the so-called rage between man and machines from both the theoretical and the empirical perspective. Well, it is quite evident from the news, specialized press, that as automation, AI, and robotics have gained momentum, simultaneously, a lot of concerns about whether robots or machines will steal our jobs are quite prominent. So there are some quite old questions that have been asked by a number of very eminent economists, such as John Maynard Keynes. He was thinking that automation would have stolen all the possible jobs and would have caused the so-called technological unemployment. Also, Vasily Leontiev weren't very positive about that. And more recently, quite a few technological gurus, such as Elon Musk or Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos, have demonstrated fears and concerns about the same topics. Of course, well, the opinions with these respects are more nuanced, but still the concerns are there. So, at this point, I would like to ask you what you do think about that. So in order to do that, I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of a poll. So if you want to participate, you just log in. Well, you go to this website, polev.com, and you enter this code, and you respond to this activity. So is automation good or bad for workers? What do you think? Yeah, you can.
You can actually go to your phones now.
Yes.
And the website and participate in the poll.
Let's see. Let me activate it, if it works. Activate.
I have a timer also.
I think what?
Full screen. No one is answering. Okay, so let's do the old-fashioned way. So you think that it depends?
I think some people did answer. So.
Well, it doesn't work anyway. See, it's not, the internet probably is fully loaded. Anyway. Well, it might depend. On what?
The nature of the work that should be done.
Okay, so.
Location, for example, exploring why goals, contribution to the solution.
It's good. Okay, good. Depends. Other ideas? In the long run, it's good. Well, okay. So there is a. Okay, there are different ideas for sure. And what I'm going to show you now is a little bit of data about the US and the UK job markets and the interpretation that could be given to these findings in the light of a growth model that has been developed by Acemoglu and Restrepo quite recently, and it is called the task-based growth model. So in this picture, well, these are two charts. I'm not sure why the title went up there. Anyway, what could be seen is the so-called job polarization. In both graphs, the jobs have been ordered by skills. So at the bottom left-hand side of both graphs, you have low-skilled jobs, while towards the right-hand side, you have high-skilled jobs. And what could be seen, and they are related to the employment growth rate. So what could be seen is that the jobs have increased both at the bottom end and at the top end of the employment distribution, while they have shrinked, employment has decreased in the middle skills jobs. And this result is quite robust across surveys and across time, where these estimates come from two different sources. Here there is another very interesting stylized fact from the US, and this is taken from Acemoglu and Restrepo. And here instead, we could see that there is a positive correlation between employment growth and the fact that, and the title of the job. So if the job has a new title, then there is a prediction that there will be employment growth in this particular category. I try to explain myself a little bit better. In the 80s, there were no managerial analyst, and so managerial analyst was a new job title. In the 90s, a new job title was technician radiologist, and in the 2000s we have the software developers. So if people employ themselves in these new jobs, in these new jobs we will have employment growth. Then a little bit on the country where I live, that is the UK. So in the UK, well, there is again a good evidence of job polarization at the bottom and at the top end of the skills distribution. And the ONS, that is the Office of National Statistics for the UK, is predicting that in 10, 20 years, there will be 35% of the jobs will be automated, so will be stolen by machines. But this estimate does not agree with another estimate that has been done by the OECD. And in particular, the OECD estimate just a 10% of the jobs. So why there is this discrepancy? The OECD, well, has correctly observed that job destruction, that there are not, the automation does not occur at the job level. It occurs at the skill level, at the task level. So there are some tasks that are automated and other tasks that are not automated. If you take, for example, the consultancies, well, there are some tasks that are very repetitive, like the routine task, the administrative tasks that can be automated. But other tasks that are more front office, where the consultant needs to interact with a client, that requires judgment, interaction, cannot be easily automated. And thus, when you observe this more closely, at a more granular level, at the task level, the amount of jobs that are predicted to be automated decreases. And the theoretical framework that predicts these kind of scenarios is the task-based framework. And well, as according to this theoretical model, which is a really good paper, I really encourage you to read it, you have different type of labor. You have low skill, medium skill, and high skill labor, which are combined in a continuum of tasks, and at the end, you get into a unique final good. In this framework, there are two types of technological change. One is automation, and the other is new tasks. So technological change can be automation when the tasks that were previously performed by labor are substituted by robots, are automated. And in this case, we have job displacement. Why is that? Because, well, as labor can be easily substituted with machines, the demand for labor decreases, the wages decrease, the employment share decreases, the wage bill decreases. And thus, we observe this collapse in the middle, in the medium scale jobs. But at the same time, there is a productivity effect, because the labor that is still there in the same job becomes a little bit more productive thanks to automation. But overall, the net effect is displacement. So productivity effect is not big enough under the automation to prevail. Instead, if technological change is able to create new tasks, like the new job titles, and thus, well, labor is able to complement this innovative technological change, labor becomes really more productive, and we have that we need workers in these tasks. And thus there is the productivity effect that prevails, and there is a job reinstatement. So, automation is going to substitute routine tasks, and routine tasks are the ones that are the repetitive ones, the ones that can be easily coded and a machine can be easily instructed to do them. Non-routine tasks are the ones that are very difficult to be codified, and probably they are not very well understood. Quite an example of routine task is the toll payment. So nowadays, at least in Europe and in the US, we have that the majority of the tolls are fully automated. So, well, the model of Acemoglu and Restrepo can match the empirical evidence, the U-shape we observed in the data, and it can take into account job polarization. So automation, as we said, basically substitute routine tasks that are quite concentrated in middle skilled jobs, but is not able to substitute labor both at the bottom and the top end of the skills distribution. Well, also low skills jobs that are really labor intensive can be difficult to be automated. Think about childcare. Well, minding a child is totally unpredictable, so you cannot tell a machine, please mind my child. And at the upper end, instead, we have high-skilled jobs in which, a lot of abstract thinking is required, and thus they are very difficult to be replaced as well. Okay, so this is the situation in developed economies. This is the theoretical framework I think is worth to be using to understand the future of the labor market and workers in the light of automation. And now I'm going to provide you a little bit of facts about emerging economies. Well, to start with, there is very scant and scarce evidence about the impact of automation in emerging economies. But still, we can observe something. The first question I asked myself was whether jobs in emerging markets are exposed to automation. And I found some statistics, and there is evidence of cross-country variation. So robots are getting into different countries at a different pace, and this depends, of course, to the stage of development the countries are in. China is automating quite at a fast pace currently, and we can also see on the colored graph that some jobs seems to be have lost to automation since the 2000s. Then another interesting question is whether jobs are exposed to routinization. So does the routine hypothesis holds in developing countries or not? It seems so. This graph is taken by, from Das and Ingelstock, another very good paper. This graph represents on the horizontal axis the initial exposure to routinization. This index, the exposure to routinization, has been calculated by David Autor for the US initially. And basically what he did was taking this dictionary of job occupations they have in the US and calculating the difference between tasks that are routine tasks, then minus the tasks that are manual, minus the tasks that are abstract. And thus, the bigger the number, the higher the exposure to routinization. So, on the vertical axis, instead, there is the change in exposure to routinization between 2010 and 2015. So we have in blue the advanced economies and in red the emerging ones. So what we can say is that in the period considered, advanced economies were more exposed to routinization. This is something not probably much surprising, and is not very much surprising also the fact that with time they are less exposed, probably because they are getting already out these middle skills jobs and they're pushing themselves towards the upper end. So the quality of the jobs are somehow increasing, while for what concerns the emerging economies, the opposite is going to be true. So they started from a lower exposure to routinization, and this can be explained thinking to the fact that emerging markets use less capital. Production in emerging economies are less capital intense, and thus they are less exposed to machine. But at the same time, well, they are predicted to be more and more exposed to routinization with time. Why is that? Well, for two reasons. The first one is structural transformation. So, well, there has been quite a lot of evidence of emerging markets passing from agricultural production to manufacturing production. And the second one is globalization, in the sense that advanced economies or other economies, firms exporting or outsourcing routinary tasks to emerging markets. That's why we have this negative correlation. And thus, the final prediction for what concerns emerging markets is that there is a tendency towards convergence in the rate of routinization. So emerging markets are increasingly more exposed to automation, and the job markets probably will look U-shaped in few years. So to conclude, if the routinization hypothesis is going to hold in emerging markets, for sure this will have quite huge consequences. Well, if we think about the fact that emerging markets have a lot of workers, routinization will mean a lot of job losses. The second consequence that was mentioned even before is premature deindustrialization. This means basically that less and less people will be employed in the manufacturing sector. Danny Roderick has observed this fact quite a while ago already. Then, as routinization is going to benefit the ones at the upper end of the skill distribution, and is going to remunerate with higher salaries the employees that are performing non-routinary tasks, the wages of the very skilled are going to increase, and these might increase inequality as well. On the good side, as according to Das and Ingelstock, this process seems to be not very imminent. They say not in the next 5 years. I'm not sure if it is a good news or not. And for the suggestion, what is the policy recommendation given this scenario? Probably the one of Elon Musk, that is study engineering. So specialize in something in which labor is needed, but is going to complement machines. Yes, thank you. These are the references.
Thank you so much, Silvia.
Sorry? The references.
The references?
Sure.
Thank you very much for the very interesting coverage and the very interesting presentation. I think we can now first move on to the second speaker, Vladimir. You want the speaker?
Yeah, it would be great.
Sure, I need to move.
I was asked to sit down, and so I hope it will work out like this. And so I have a disappointment for you that I will continue the discussion that Ragiasa had this morning and Francesco Pastore had earlier. I will my presentation will deal with the current situation in the Egyptian labor market, and only tangentially I can say something about, I can speculate what will happen because of the fourth industrial revolution in Egypt and in the region. So I'll come back to it at the end of the presentation. But I thought that the best way I can contribute to the debate at this conference is to present some of my own results from my joint research with Shireen Al-Azawi, who I've written a couple of studies with, and so I'll present hopefully some of the interesting results about vulnerable workers, so vulnerable youth workers in Egypt, female labor force participation rate, and maybe something about the role of migration in the region. How does Beamer work? Oops, no? No?
That side arrow, yeah.
Very short click.
Can I put a light? Is there a light? The light doesn't work? It's fine. That's okay. I'll make do without light. And so the backdrop of my presentation is that there are various structural problems in the Egyptian labor market. I will not get into it, and I hope that I don't have to answer any questions about this. But the standard kind of shopping list is that there are these formal and informal firms and formal informal workers. There's duality between them, which makes it hard for workers to switch type of job and for companies to switch their position in the market. We can also point out to the role of the public sector, which we can say crowds out talent. There's this large public sector as an employer. It might be diminishing over time in Egypt, but it still plays a significant role. And we can, I think relevant to this discussion is the role of education, and we've had some debate about that. From my perspective, I think the secondary and tertiary schools do not teach the necessary productive skills, and something new is needed, either some kind of university corporate collaboration, or universities need to restructure to teach the skills that are more needed, especially in the digital economy. I can come back to it at the end of the presentation. Okay. And so I will get into some specific results for the vulnerable employment of Egyptian youth and the fate of women in the labor market, and maybe the role of migration. So so all of these structural problems that I mentioned in the Egyptian economy are hard on youth workers, because youth workers find it hard to get into formal jobs. It's not clear to them how youth workers should be accumulating human capital, whether through formal education or through some other ways. And youth workers have a dilemma whether to seek employment in the public sector or private sector. So all of these structural problems are related to youth. And in one paper that Shireen Al-Azawi and I wrote, we studied social mobility of workers distinguishing the experience of youth workers against that of older workers. And we did find that youth workers have a particularly hard time transitioning to better forms of employment, better sectors. They have lower odds of becoming employed in any type of employment compared to non-youth, particularly formal employment or as employers. And university graduates, compared to less educated youth workers, have among the highest odds of staying unemployed. Perhaps because they have high expectations of landing good quality jobs, but the jobs are not there, so they spend a lot of time searching for jobs. And I'll show some evidence how that works out. Women have lower odds of joining the labor force, particularly private sector, and there are gender gaps in the odds of employment. And these are large in Egypt, especially even by the standards of the MENA region. And there are some results that point to deteriorating labor market conditions during 1998 and 2012. So I will use, for the most part, the labor market panel surveys for Egypt up to year 2012. So Francesco and Raghi went beyond that, and I hope that I will not repeat too much of their findings, and I will show slightly different perspective than them, I hope. So looking at the job transitions of youth male workers in Egypt between 1998 and 2006 and 1998 and 2012, these graphs show the distribution of jobs, distribution of employment status across 2 years. On the x-axis, we have different employment status as of 1998, and on the y-axis, we see the distribution of the jobs for these employees as of 2006. So, for example, we see that among youth workers who were in the formal private sector in 1998, by year 2006, 56% of them were still employed in the formal private sector, 13% were in the formal public sector, and so on. One fascinating statistic is that of the formal public workers as of 1998, 8 years later in 2006, 82% were still employed in the formal public sector. So there is very little sectoral mobility. Once workers get a job in the formal public sector, they're guaranteed to have this job for a very long time. You might think that 8 years is not that much, but when we look at, when we compare the employment status between 1998 and 2012, 14 years apart, we see essentially the same statistics. So among formal private sector workers, formal public sector workers in 1998, 81% had the same sector of employment 14 years later. This is relevant to me personally because I've been in academia for 13 years, and now I'm switching jobs from a Korean university to working in Beirut at Ewha. So even for myself, I see myself switching sectors and world regions, but looking at these youth workers, 14 years later, they're still in the same sector, so they have very high job security. Looking at other types of workers, so in 1998, looking at the irregular wage workers or informal private sector workers, we see some fluidity, but only fluidity between similar types of workers. So among the irregular wage workers, some of them, in the following 8 years or 14 years, they might switch to from irregular wage work to informal work or vice versa, but there's very little transition from irregular informal to formal private, to formal type of job. Well, looking at these figures, we might think that well, these are pretty historic figures. 1998 is a long time ago. Would we see different figures if we looked at more recent years? So comparing 2006 and 2012, we see very similar statistics. So in 2006, if you were a formal, if you were a youth, formal public sector worker, you have a 75% probability to remain in the formal public sector 6 years later, okay? Similarly, if you were in irregular or informal type of work, you are most likely to remain in that type of work 6 years later. Are there any changes between 98 through 2006 and here 2006 through 2012? There are some small changes. So it seems that formal public and formal private jobs are not as secure as they used to be between 98 and 2006. So here we have only, among formal private sector workers in 2006, only 44% remain in formal private sector by 2012. Among formal public, only 75% compared to 81 or 82% that we saw on the previous slide. And I think that these numbers are meaningful. I think we see some shift between informal, irregular versus formal types of jobs. So the formal sectors are becoming less secure, less different from informal employment. One other thing that we notice is that the share of irregular and informal sector work has increased between 98 through 2006 and 2006-2012. So I think, so in these figures we see some of the points that Ragiasa mentioned this morning. One, the irregular and informal type of work is becoming more prevalent. Between 98 and 2006 and 2006 to 2012, we already see that informal work became much more prevalent. Right here, if you used to be an irregular wage worker in 98, you had a 50% chance of remaining irregular or informal 8 years later. While in 2006, if you were an irregular worker, now you have a nearly 70% chance, 2/3 chance of remaining irregular or informal by 2012. Whether these numbers would continue by 2018, I believe so, but I would have to check. Okay, so well, one policy recommendation has been that to deal with the duality between formal and informal employment sectors would be to get them to merge together, to get the formal sector to absorb informal types of jobs. But maybe what this suggests that instead of the formal market absorbing informal jobs, maybe it's vice versa, that now informal jobs are spreading, formal employment is slowly kind of disappearing, and so it seems that it's more that informal economy is absorbing the formal economy, which may not be a good thing, which may mean that working conditions are deteriorating, and that's not the type of convergence that we would want. So I think that's one interesting message that that I speculate on. And another thing that I take from these figures is, well, if I was a youth worker in 1998 and my objective is to land a formal public or private job in the next 8 years, what is my strategy? Should I be searching for work? Should I stay out of the labor force and do other things? Do some, go to private academies or travel around the world to learn languages or spend my time in other ways, invest in my human capital in some informal ways? Or should I accept informal or irregular employment for the time being? What's the best strategy for me to eventually land the formal job? And according to, if we trust these numbers, one interpretation would be that the best strategy would be to stay out of labor force as of 1998. Okay? Because if I stay out of labor force and invest in my human capital in some informal ways, I have a, what's this, 30% chance of landing a formal job in the next 8 years. If I search for jobs, if I continue searching for formal employment, I only have a 20% chance, 19% chance of landing a formal job eventually. If I accept informal or irregular work, again, something like 20% chance. So the best strategy appears to be to stay out of labor force entirely and invest in my human capital in not through formal education or formal markets. Okay? That seems to change by 2006. And I'm not sure what to make of it, but at least that's something that I need to think about. If I was a youth worker in 2006 and I wanted to land a formal job in the next 6 years, should I stay unemployed and search for job actively? Should I accept some informal or irregular employment or be out of labor force? I should keep searching for formal jobs. Okay, now I have a 31% chance of landing a formal job if I keep searching, whereas if I stay out of labor force, my chances are 19%. Okay, so the strategy for youth workers might be changing over time. I'm curious what would happen by 2012 and 2018. Okay, so that's about job transitions. Just to say a little bit about the distribution of employment sectors in 2012 between men and women, comparing youth workers and non-youth workers, we see a lot of changes. So these are quite expected numbers, that youth workers don't get many formal jobs in the public sector. Most of them, if they get a job, they get irregular or informal job. As workers get older, there is a higher chance of having formal private, especially formal public employment. How would this change? How would this change by 2018? Probably formal public employment is less of an opportunity now than in 2012, but still remains an important prospect. How are things different for women? Especially, how are female young workers versus older workers different in their employment prospects? Not different at all. Okay, so for women, it's a lifelong problem. It's not a youth problem, it's a lifelong problem. So I think earlier today we heard that youth unemployment is a problem for men, but I think it's important to stress the contrary, that just for women, the problem is also there, except that it's a lifelong problem. It's not a youth problem, it's a lifelong big problem. Okay, showing how do these employment prospects change over time? Again, these graphs show very expected results. That for men and women in 2006, the prospect of landing formal employment increases after the age of 30. Before the age of 30, very low prospect of having formal employment. Here I lump together formal private and formal public. And so we can say that up until the age of 26 or so, the chance of landing informal employment is much higher than the chance of landing formal employment. As of 2012, the situation deteriorated very much, right? Now, the chance of landing formal employment is much lower all the way to the age of 35, and much higher chance of landing informal employment. So in that sense, the conditions became much worse. How are things for women in 2006, 2012? Once again, we see a little bit of deterioration, that women had some prospect of having formal employment up to the age of something like 40, 45. Now they have, after 35 years of age, the prospect of formal employment disappears. And so even for women, we see some deterioration, but just the conditions were always very bad. Urban, rural, I can just point in one sentence that the conditions are worse for men in rural areas than in urban areas. For women, the only difference between these two figures is that the prospect of formal employment disappears by the time rural women reach the age of something like 32, 33 years of age. So by the time they get family, the prospects of formal employment effectively disappear. Okay, I'm out of time, so let me just say, okay, 2 minutes left. So what can we say more about female labor force participation rate? Well, this table shows the female labor force participation rate for a range of years for different countries and regions of the world. We see, again, we know that the rate for the Middle East and for Egypt are much lower than elsewhere in the world. One thing to notice is that during the financial crisis, in most of these world regions, the female labor force participation rate fell a little bit. Okay? In some regions, we see that the situation was improving. It temporarily fell during the crisis, and it started improving again. Or in other regions, it was declining. It declined fast during the crisis years, and then continued either declining or rising afterwards. But one thing, so this is related to the question of, there's a hypothesis that as economies develop, the female labor force participation rate should show a U-shaped pattern. That as the economy transitioned from agriculture to manufacturing to services, we should find female situation to become worse, but eventually start improving. So what this table adds to this discussion is that we have to account for temporary shocks, such as the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Okay, so we don't see a steady trend, but we see some temporary shocks that we would have to account for when testing the hypothesis. Let me stop right here. So I'll show one last. And 2 last sentences. I will say that, well, the prospects for the employment situation because of the 4th Industrial Revolution. There is a recent UN Ewha report as of August this year, and I just want to make reference to that report. Well, the report is, I think, kind of pessimistic that new technologies are being adopted and developed, but very gradually, very slowly. What will this new development eventually do to jobs? Well, it may not. This transition to new technology might get rid of jobs, but it will not get rid of work. to understand what will happen in different MENA region countries, we should look at how reliant, what is the composition of the economy, and what are the skills of labor force. We can make some positive and negative predictions about the job opportunities for men and for women as the economies transition to the new technology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. We're now going to give Professor Raghi Asad around 10 minutes for the discussion of the two very interesting presentations.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just heard the papers like you heard them just now, so I'm going to have some impressionistic comments. Let me start with the first paper, which is kind of worrying about the effect of technology on the future of work and whether it's a positive effect or negative effect. Let me just start by saying that this kind of worry is not new. At the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, people were extremely worried about exactly the same issue. And in fact, there was a lot of talk about destruction of jobs. In particular, at that point, it was craft-based jobs being displaced by industrial-type jobs, and that was a huge worry. And you know, there are movements, the Luddites and others, who were really trying to fight very much the industrialization process. So I think we're in every industrial revolution, whether we're the first or the fourth, we're going to expect that the rate of creative destruction, where essentially things being destroyed in order for new things to emerge, is going to be higher and is going to be always painful. The transition is never easy. But the question is, what we need to worry about is the net effect. The net effect historically has been positive for job creation, in the sense that the creation of new tasks, new jobs, new opportunities always exceeded the destructive effects, but with very uncertain timing and varied location, varied groups being affected, and clearly very large social dislocations. So, for example, in the US, we see that these middle-level jobs are being cored out or destroyed at a higher rate. And it actually happens to be a lot of blue-collar male occupations that are in the middle level. But in the same time, you have some middle-level jobs and low and middle-level jobs in the health sector, like nursing, in other sectors that are attracting female workers in a great deal, and they're expanding. And so you have this kind of shift by gender in the US labor market that's very, very strong, where blue-collar males are losing out, but women are gaining to some extent. And in fact, if you look at the voting patterns in US elections, they're very related to that kind of shift. Blue-collar males very much vote for Trump because they are very angry at what's happening to them in terms of their displacement. And in fact, it's also the one group in which life expectancy seems to be declining after a long period of increase in life expectancy. So that clearly the effect of technology is going to be very different depending on which groups, which demographic we're looking at, which regions we're looking at, and maybe which countries we're looking at. So one cannot make simple predictions that everybody is going to be negatively affected or everybody is going to be positively affected. There's going to be a tremendous amount of upheaval, which means that we have to work very hard on creating better social safety nets and on basically untying social safety nets from employment. Right now, under the Industrial Revolution, your social security, your health care is tied with your job. And that is a problem. If the job is disappearing, then you're losing also your social safety net and coverage. And if people are now moving to what is called the gig economy, where they don't have regular jobs, they're just moving from one job to the next, they're doing things online, they're doing, but they're also losing their retirement and their healthcare coverage. So we need to move to systems in which the economy is flexible, people move from one job to the other, become, and don't have lifetime jobs, but social safety net becomes a right of citizenship rather than tied to a job. So as a citizen, you have a right to health care. As a citizen, you have a right to retirement benefits, et cetera, which then makes the dislocation much less problematic. So that's in terms of mostly the Western world and what's happening there. But how is that affecting emerging economies, and how it would affect a country like Egypt in particular? I think first of all, we are quite used to this kind of gig economy. We call it informalization, right? So informalization and gig economy are very similar. And the irregular work that I talked about earlier this morning, the outside of establishment, is very similar to a gig economy. So that sort of vulnerability and insecurity in the labor market is something that is quite common and we're used to for different reasons, not for technological reasons. So my thinking about this is that we're likely to be affected by this kind of wave of the fourth industrial revolution indirectly rather than directly. It used to be in the US that people were debating whether it's better to offshore certain tasks versus automate them. And offshoring won out for a long time. Basically, globalization made a lot of industrial jobs leave rich countries and go to developing countries. China benefited a great deal from that. So offshoring won out. However, I see a retracting of offshoring and now an increase in automation. So it's going to be shifting from offshoring to automation. The impact on the West is going to be probably similar in terms of the kinds of jobs that are lost, but the problem is that now we, on the receiving end of this offshoring, are no longer going to get these jobs. So, for example, for a while there was a huge opportunity in basically outsourcing of services. It's not just manufacturing, but service jobs were being offshored. India took a great advantage of that, was really at the right time. But now there's a question mark. To what extent are these service jobs going to be automated and therefore not available for offshoring? So the outsourcing opportunities, and Egypt actually is very well placed to be on the receiving end of these outsourcing opportunities in the service economy. And, but there is a question mark about the extent to which these opportunities will actually emerge if there is a great deal of automation in these service jobs. But I think it's a question mark. I don't think it's happening yet. I think there are still many opportunities to be had in capturing some of these outsourced service opportunities. And the customer service area, a lot of it cannot be automated very easily. The technical support area, there's a whole bunch of jobs in the service economy that can be offshored but not automated so easily. So maybe I'll stop here in terms of that first paper. I have a lot to say on the second paper. I'm not going to say it all. I think I'm going to talk to Vladimir on the side. But let me just, I think it's really important to disaggregate the discussion by gender in the case of Egypt. Because while it's true that educated workers tend to be more unemployed because they do have higher expectations of obtaining a formal job. And in fact, there are incentives to wait for this formal job to come, because once you have an informal job, it's very difficult to move to a formal job, as Vladimir showed. And therefore, educated workers will search for a while. However, men and women have different options. In the case of men, they have to land a job eventually. And so they're going to end up in an informal job. So they'll search for a while. Once their search becomes unsuccessful, their fallback position is an informal job. And they're going to end up there. Whereas women, their fallback position is not entering employment in the first place. Their fallback, there are certain minimum reservation working conditions. This is working conditions that would be acceptable to them, their families, their communities. Below those working conditions, they will not enter. And therefore, their fallback position is to be either remain unemployed or to exit the labor force. So for them, what we see is a transition from unemployment to out of the labor force rather than unemployment to informality. And that happens usually at marriage. When they search, they remain unemployed until they're married, and then at marriage, they transition to being out of the labor force. And so that becomes their fallback position. And it makes a huge difference then for them if a public sector job is available, they will eventually get that because that is above the reservation working conditions. They actually will are looking for that kind of job, whereas most informal private sector jobs are below the reservation conditions of most women, and therefore they will, especially married women. Married women find it very hard to make their employment and their work and their home lives compatible in the private sector, especially in informal, but even in the formal private sector. We see that in the data very clearly, that those who do enter into private employment before marriage exit at marriage, whereas those who enter into public employment at marriage continue throughout till retirement. So the implications then is why are we seeing women's labor force participation declining, especially among educated women? Because among less educated women, it's low anyway, and it's not changing. But where the decline is occurring is among educated women, where they were working at quite high rates, and now increasingly from one survey to the other, we see a decline in labor force participation among educated women, and it's because they're not, and if you superimpose the rate at which they're working in the public sector, it's almost the exact graph. As public sector opportunities decline, labor force participation of the educated women decline, especially the married educated women. And so the story here is not, unfortunately, what Vladimir talked about being the U-shaped curves that we see in many countries. No, it is the decline in opportunities in the public sector, which leads to fewer acceptable jobs for women, and therefore lower participation rates among educated women. And I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for the very interesting insights. We're going to now open the floor for a few comments. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question for Silvia. In case of automation, do you think that there will be a kind or a sort of ludism or fear of technology movement like which is happening in the UK in the 19th century? And that will therefore affect or will have a detrimental effect in the process of the automation. And in such case, do you think that such fear is appropriate, that is acceptable for people to feel like that? Thanks.
Thanks for the presentation. I have two questions for Vladimir. The first is, this trend at informalization, is it just indicating the change in labor relations, so due to flexibilization, neoliberalization, or does it have to do with the creation of these informal low productivity jobs as well? So the link between this informalization and productivity of workers, this is something that I would like to hear if you have any data on. And the other issue is the sources of this informalization. Does it have to do with the contraction in public employment that is feeding into more private sector employment that is by definition overwhelmingly informal, or is it something else? Thank you.
My comment is basically for Vladimir and maybe Professor Pastore, because they both recommended as a policy integration of soft skills, you said, and more corporate with universities, sort of more collaboration. And I tend to believe exactly the opposite, that the more this happens, the less opportunity people have on the job, because, I mean, I work in technology, I'm not an academic, but the more people get early, the more the universities actually integrate more corporate specific curricula or qualifying students for corporate, the less they are educated, and that makes them more susceptible to being unable to learn as the market develops. I mean, at least in technology, the market develops very fast, and the one thing, you cannot prepare someone now for a job in 15 years because the job probably doesn't exist yet. So it's very difficult, when this starts to happen, when academia starts to integrate more corporate values, the quality of graduates, at least from where I see it, actually declines, and their opportunity in long-term job stability declines as well because they are not equipped. So I'd just like to hear your thoughts about it.
Here in the back, and then.
Thank you very much indeed. How can you explain that the employment here in Egypt has reduced, and the inflation in Egypt reduced or reduction from about 31% until less than 5%, while the poverty increased from 28 until 32%? Thanks a lot.
And then the last question here.
في نقطتين عايز احب احطهم واحنا بنحط في موضوع الاتمته. لما ظهر التلفزيون كان في الراديو، الناس كلها خافت ان الراديو هينقضي عليه، بالعكس هو ما زال ليه وجود. النقطه الثانيه، في 1999 دخلنا في اشكاليه زيرو ال2000 في الكمبيوتر وما هيأثر عليه في البنوك وفي المصانع عشنا حاله رعب لمده سنه. في اخر 1999 لما اتنقلنا لل2000 اللي هو موضوع الزيرو ما حصلش حاجه. فهل احنا النهارده في هذا الوهم برضو ان احنا خايفين من الاتمته، لكن هو وهم؟ صحيح ليها دور، بس هي في الاخر هيبقى وهم. شكرا.
Thank you very much. I think we can now give time to the presenters to answer the questions. So would you like to start? You want to start first?
Okay. The first question for me was about informalization of jobs, and I don't. So what can explain the transition from formal economy to informal economy? One, there was deregulatory measures. So I think there's a public policy that can explain why formal employment became less secure compared to historically. Then I think the decline of public sector employment. I think, well, I don't have a full understanding, but I think it's a number of factors. I think technology has something to do, just the transformation of the economy. The change in the size distribution of firms, I think technological factors may favor micro and small firms, and there were political changes under Mubarak, and so I think it's a lot of factors that I have a hard time judging what was the contribution of each of these factors. So economic factors, policy factors, the role of public sector employment, and yeah. So I can't clearly point to the one source. The question about what kind of education would be better than the formal education? Well, I think I mentioned the university, corporate university links as an example. I think, so clearly there is a mismatch between the skills that formal education teaches and what employers want. It's not a problem just in Egypt. Actually, the same link, the same background I started, I could have replaced the word Egyptian, and I could have talked about the Korean labor market, and I would have left the rest of the slide the same way. Korean labor market, however much we think of the Asian tigers, how successful they are, they have a lot of problems, maybe a different scale than the problems in the Egyptian labor market, but these are factors that are identified for the Korean market. Duality between formal and informal firms, public sector crowding out talent, it's the same thing. Korean students spend years studying for exams to enter public sector. There's a lot of waste of their time, waste of talent. The formal education in Korea now teaches students to prepare for standardized tests. It doesn't teach them to be creative, critical, analytical, social skills. In these measures, Korean students completely fail, and Egyptian students might be failing in that too. I think so. Ideas how to overcome that? Well, either the formal educational sector has to have a revolution, or the students have to look for other options. In Korea, the problem is with after-school programs. So students go to school from the morning until 5 p.m., and then they go to after-school programs until midnight, and their parents are paying for that. And that's where the kids are learning useful stuff. Then they go to school in the morning and they sleep because they couldn't sleep at night. So they sleep during the formal education times, and then they actually learn useful stuff in the private sector after-school programs. Is that a good solution? No, but something needs to be done differently. So university corporate relations, or having more analytical, critical writing courses, I think that would be very important. Encourage travel. I think spending time in the formal educational environment. I don't know how it is in Egypt, but in other countries, you don't learn to socialize, and so there are many of these skills that are very important in the digital economy that you just don't learn through the formal educational process. I didn't understand the question about poverty.
That's all right.
And so I can address that after the session.
Thank you so much. We're going to leave the room
Yes.
for
Well, about the Ludism movement, I'm not sure, but I would say, just as a matter of speculation, that probably young people won't initiate a Ludism movement. Young people love technology, and I think that in a sense, they like flexibility, not going to an office, being free to organize themselves if they could. For what concerns maybe people that are displaced, probably yes, but this is quite a very common stories. We can say it, well, we have very many examples, I think, across the countries. And as for what concerns automation and the fact that there has been a lot of creative destruction along the years, yes, I do agree that some technologies are created and other technologies are disrupted. But well, the point is that, well, to me, as a person very interested in growth, applied growth and growth theory, I think that technology is what makes labor more productive and countries potentially richer. So, well, I think that it is quite normal to have all the new technologies going together.
Thank you very much. We're now going to have final comments from Professor Raghi.
Okay, maybe I'll start with Amr's comment about informalization. So basically, both two things that you mentioned are at work. One, the contraction of the public sector is definitely leading into a formal contraction of formal jobs, like a numerical contraction of formal job. If the formal private sector was growing fast enough to provide formal jobs, it would have absorbed this and there would be no necessary informalization. But what's happening is that the formal private sector is very anemic. It's not growing fast enough. And so the informal economy is absorbing the excess labor that's released here. Now, there is some informal employment in informal enterprises, right? So even some very large formal enterprises, about 20% of their employees are informal in order to have a cushion in case they need to adjust their workforces flexibly. And so they hire people for a while informally, and then they may formalize them after a while. But most of informal employment is taking place in informal enterprises, right? I'd say 8 out of 10 of the informal workers are in informal enterprises. So there is a problem with the formalization of the enterprise for a variety of reasons that have to do with business climate, taxation, etc. And so you're not going to be able to solve the informalization of employment unless you do something about the informalization within the enterprise space. Now that has productivity implications, because if you're forced as an enterprise to remain informal, you're often forced to remain small, and therefore you cannot benefit from economies of scale and other things that can affect productivity, and you don't make the transition to being kind of small and medium. Now, what I talked about this morning is that there seems to be, recently, only since 2006, greater growth of small and medium enterprises. So I think that's going to counter a little bit that story, but it's very recent, so you don't see its effect so much on formalization yet, and it's being counteracted by the growth of the retail sector and the construction sector and other things that are mostly informal. Okay, so on the inflation, poverty, unemployment story. So basically, the poverty statistics are between 2015 and 2018. That's when poverty increased, and this is the time in which inflation was at its highest, right? This is the time when inflation peaked, and only very recently did inflation come down to 5%. We don't have any statistics about poverty from very recently. So we don't know what happened between 2018 and 2019, which is the time at which, and unemployment, the same thing. The decline in unemployment is very recent. It's really over the last 2 quarters of 2018 and the 2 quarters of 2019. And so, so again, it's not connected to the poverty story. The decline in unemployment, as I said earlier this morning, is really the result of a slow increase in the labor force rather than an increase in employment. So employment has not increased. In fact, the employment to population ratio is also declining, but overall participation in the labor force is declining, and the size of the youth labor force demographically is not growing very fast. And that's creating a decline in unemployment, because unemployment is only in Egypt an entry phenomenon. It's among youth trying to enter the labor force. So if there are fewer youth trying to enter, there is lower unemployment. And that's a demographic phenomenon which is short-lived, because we have a wave of young people who are now in between the age of 4 and 15 years old, who is very large, and they're going to start coming into the labor force over the next 10 years. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you all very much, and thank you for the speakers and the presenters. We hope you enjoyed this session, and we're going to end it now, moving on to the final session. Thank you very much.